Today we're talking about food and water. And I guess you can't really get much more essential than that. We all know what it's like to be physically hungry, physically thirsty. In fact, one of the main issues in the world today is that people are going without adequate food and water supply. We see this in pictures of the third world and those ads that we see on TV. And so often we pity them because we know that they are missing something that we have. And you know, when I went on my first overseas experience, it was a short-term mission trip. We looked after kids and we did some clearing of a churchyard, and we were of some small use to them. But the main change that took place was in our own hearts. We saw such vitality, such love, such community that we hadn't experienced back home. Sometimes I think that we in the West are the ones who are missing out on having our core needs met. The people we saw in poverty at times find themselves without access to nutritious food and clean water. But we often are the ones who are hungry and thirsty for love and purpose, things that are intangible, free, and readily available. Today, I want to talk to two types of people. You might put yourself in either of these camps here. Those who after a long year are tired and thirsty, and those who are hungry for meaning and purpose. And it's important to recognize which season you're in, because a word in season will flourish, but a word in the wrong season will be like weeds taking over a garden, choking the life out of it. So today, are you tired and weary? Are you needing to be filled? Or are you hungry for meaning and purpose and wondering what life is all about? With that in mind, let's turn to the 4th chapter of John's Gospel. In John 4, verse 3 to 6, it says, Jesus left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria where Jacob's well was. And a woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." The woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" So firstly, some background. Jesus was on his way to Galilee with his disciples, but they first had to pass through Samaria. And you'll recall the story of the Good Samaritan. So a Samaritan has kind of become a word in our vocab today that is synonymous with someone who does random acts of kindness. But back in Jesus' day, Samaritans were seen by the Jews as unpleasant half-siblings they wished would cease to exist. They hated them. They were a reminder of the exile in which Israel was carried off into captivity. And the Samaritans had become intertwined with the local inhabitants, and the Jews despised them for this. So Jesus was breaking cultural barriers by talking with the Samaritan. Secondly, Jesus was talking with a woman. This was a massive faux pas in first century Judaism. What's more, Jesus considered a rabbi a man with social and religious standing. He should have known better. This could have ended his career, if you will. And if that wasn't enough, she was one of those women who even today we'd want to keep away from. Yet Jesus had no concern for his reputation. He had concern for her. He saw that she was trapped in a cycle of living that was bringing her pain, and he wanted to see her set free from her own death-bringing habits, regardless of what it meant for his own reputation. Let's read on. John 4, 10 to 14. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that's saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." And Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water I will give them will never be thirsty again." And there's a story we learned at Bible college about a Kiwi who went over to Australia. And he was traveling around with some friends, and he was going through the vast desert plains, and he noticed something particularly different about their farming methods. And he said over to his Australian friend, "Where are all the fences?" You see, in New Zealand, we have fences around every paddock, between the farm and the road, and along the boundary lines. But you've got no fences everywhere, or anywhere. Aren't you worried that your livestock will wander away? And his mate replied, "See this here outback? It's dry, it's barren, it's wild. Everything wants to kill you out here. But we don't need fences. What we do, we dig a well, and the cattle come to that well to drink. Without it, they're dead. We don't need fences because the livestock, they know what's good for them." And I love this story about boundaries and fences, about water and wells. You see, in the Old Testament, people observed the law in order to live a holy and a righteous life. That is, to live a life set apart for God, doing what's right and not living like the world says that you should. It was a restriction, a set of boundaries that they had to stay within. But in Genesis 12, verse 2, God said to Abraham, "I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing." You see, Israel was meant to be a light to the world, showing them the best way to have a healthy and loving relationship with God, and to demonstrate how knowing the love of God would affect their relationships with each other in a positive and a meaningful way. But Israel became inward focused, and they forgot that they were meant to be a blessing to others, faced with the opportunity to love their half-siblings, the Samaritans. Instead, they hated them, and they stayed clear of them as much as possible. But Jesus saw the Samaritan woman as a person in need, rather than someone evil or tainted or to be avoided. And I was up in Kerikeri with a church there, doing some filming for our TV program, Word for You. And one of the people whose testimonies we filmed, he told us a story about how he came to know Jesus. Reuben had grown up in an atheist family, believing that the only way to success in life was to work hard and earn himself respect, and then people would respect him and he would feel good about himself. And he made a name for himself. He got good at his career, but finally one day, no matter what he did, he prided himself on building relationships and being able to work through any problem. But no matter what he did, everything went wrong. He couldn't make the business deal work. And with a pregnant wife at home and the pressure to look after her, as well as the pressure to get everything right and be successful, he felt completely trapped and stressed, and he came to the end of himself. And Reuben's wife, Harmony, was from a Christian family. In fact, they were part of running the church. Her father was the pastor, her brother was the music leader, and Harmony sang in the band. Reuben, though he didn't believe, he served in the church. He said that they were a belong before you believe kind of church. Sometimes we think that people have to believe in God, then they have to behave a certain way, and then they can belong once they live up to our set of standards, up to those rules. But they were a belong before you believe kind of church. And they accepted him despite his constant stating to them that he was not at all interested in God. So if we come back to the crisis that Reuben found himself in, even that morning he'd told his wife Harmony, "I'm not going to give my life, stop talking about it." She's kind of like, "You're the one talking about it, okay?" However, he came and he served on the sound desk that morning. During the altar call, he felt something stir inside of him and found himself walking to the front of the church. And Harmony is like whispering to her brother who's on the worship bench. She's saying, "Can you believe this? Is this actually Reuben walking up?" And then Harmony's dad, who's there preaching, doing the altar call, he sees him walk up and goes, "Choo!" He gets really excited, and Reuben's like rolling his eyes, like, "Guys, don't make me walk back there." But he came forward and he gave his life to God, and now he's a fully devoted follower of Jesus. And he's found this purpose that he didn't know about, and he's super excited about sharing God with other people because he has seen how God can make a difference in his own life. And that's what the church should be. It should be a light to the world. Like Israel, it should be a blessing to the world, not a source of judgment. We should be known for our love. John 13:34-35 says, "A new commandment I give to you, love one another. Just as I've loved you, you're also to love one another. By this, all people will know you are my disciples if you love one another." People will come to know that we are God's disciples by the love we have for each other, not by the way that we argue or the way we preach or anything else. So here at The Journey, we're all about community. That's why we're working on establishing missional small groups, and that's why we have this time afterwards for coffee and snacks to get to know each other, because that's the whole point of church. Church isn't a building. It's not a place you come to hear someone preach. Church is people, God's people, his outposts of the kingdom in the world. And our small groups, they're going to be missional. They're going to be groups that will be known not because of their amazing Bible studies per se, but because of the love that people find when they come into that community full of Jesus' disciples loving each other. So how do we do that? And what's all of this got to do with John 4? Jesus said to the woman at the well, "Whoever drinks of this water that I will give them will never be thirsty again." In the Old Testament, the law was a set of limits that defined what righteousness or holiness looked like. It was a strict guideline on how we're to live, how we're to be a follower of God. But in the New Testament, we see it's all about love. We're not motivated by these external factors. We're not kept within the parameters of religion by following the rules. We're held in relationship with God by the love that we receive from him. Just like the cattle in the wilderness coming to the well to drink, so we are kept in relationship with God, not by the fences that surround us, but by the knowledge that true spiritual water is found in Jesus, in him and him alone. You see, rules don't keep us in relationship with God. His love does. And we need to be kept within, not by the fences, but we come to him because we have that need for him. And without him, we're sunk. So firstly, living water. Just as we need physical water to quench our thirst and to keep us alive, so we need spiritual water to sustain us. And the only source of this spiritual water is Jesus. And people often ask, how can you say that Christianity is the only true religion? There are so many religions, yet you're arrogant enough to think your religion is the only one of value. Remember a few weeks ago we talked about pluralism and how in the West today we've reacted to this idea of absolute truth. We're faced with an endless sea of choices, and we have to ask whether we can actually possibly distinguish any point of view from another as morally superior. You see, because we've been let down by institutions, by governments, by religious parties, by churches, we've been shaken to the point that truth seems so elusive that we'll never have certainty again. Therefore, because we no longer believe in absolute truth, instead of measuring the validity of any idea or philosophy against a standard that we know of, we just simply shrug our shoulders and we say, you know what? Each to their own, all ideas are valid, everything's true. But when we're talking about Christianity, it's not about pushing a philosophy or striving to advance our own agenda. It's about pointing people toward the source of living water. God is not man-made, as some people suggest, but we are God-made. And he knows what's good for us. When Jesus said in John 14, verse 6, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." He wasn't saying it to gain an army of people who would serve him so that he'd get rich or powerful. In fact, his followers actually wanted to make him king by force, but instead he submitted his life and he died on the cross, the ultimate act of humility. And Jesus, talking with the Samaritan woman, had no concern for his earthly reputation or his safety or his career, but he loved her and served her purely because he wanted to see her set free, to see her come to know the love of God, her Creator, to know that love in her life. You see, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. End of story. Christianity is not a philosophy at all. Christianity is about having a relationship with Jesus, the only true source of living water. It's about loving others because they, like us, have been created by God and He loves them too. Salvation is knowing God and coming into a revelation of His love for us, knowing and experiencing His power in our lives, power that changes us from getters into givers, from people who are concerned about our reputation to people who are concerned about others. And you know, the world is full of thirsty people. Reuben came to the end of himself. He was tired and thirsty. He found that he could not find lasting fulfillment in his work or what people thought of him, because at some point everything fell apart. Instead, he turned to Jesus for spiritual sustenance, and now he's excited by the change that happened in his life. And what people are looking for is something that will quench their thirst. So Jesus said in Matthew 11:28-30, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden. I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So what does this mean? A yoke is one of those contraptions that sits on the shoulders of beasts to keep them in line with each other. And so it is with us and Jesus. We're yoked together to do our work. And Jesus has taken away our unsuitable and heavy burden, the one that we've been given by the world around us, by other people's expectations, by our own expectations, or even our positive desires. But we've given ourselves these burdens that are too heavy for us to carry, what we were not designed to do. And He takes that yoke and He just trashes it and He gives us a new one. A new yoke, a new burden in the positive sense. A light burden, work for us to do that we are created for. So Jesus says, "Come to me and find rest. Come to me and find work that you're designed for. Come to me, I am the source of living water. If you come to me to drink, you'll find a source of love that wells up to eternal life." His living water is not temporary. It doesn't need a top-up. The water that Jesus gives can completely quench our thirst. So our first point is come to Jesus. He's the only source of living water that won't run dry. So firstly, living water. Secondly, food. John 4:31-34. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I've got food to eat that you don't know about." And the disciples said to one another, "Has anyone brought him something to eat?" Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work." I just glossed over this the first, 10 times I read it. And then I thought, his food is to do the will of God. Verse 34 reminds me so much of Ephesians 2:10. For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them. So that burden, that yoke that Jesus has given us is not something that's meant to weigh us down, but something that's meant to bring us freedom. and the plans and purposes that God has prepared for us. We just need to be ready and willing to walk in them. Our food, our sustenance, what gives us growth is to do the will of God. And when we do, we'll find joy and meaning in our lives. Do you ever wonder about the early church? They sold their possessions. They went around telling everyone about what they'd seen. Really, think about it. They'd seen a man live again after enduring a painful and public execution. And if Jesus had not really come back to life and visited them in the flesh after he'd been killed, they would have probably just carried on as normal and completely forgotten about the gospel. It wouldn't have been good news at all if Jesus hadn't been resurrected from the dead. But in fact, they saw the resurrected Christ and they were completely changed. They wanted everyone to know about him, even if sharing their testimony, even if saying that Jesus had been present in the flesh after his resurrection, even if that ended up with their torture or death. They had no concern for themselves. They just loved other people. And in Jesus, they found the source of living water, and they'd wanted to share what they'd found with others. It just overflowed out of them. But here's the thing with water. When a river or a stream has momentum, it can be completely difficult to contain it. But when it stops flowing, it becomes a stagnant pool. And so it is with us. We need to overflow with that love, or else the blessings God has given us will fail to be a blessing to the world around us. And the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 3, we looked at this only a few weeks ago, I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you weren't ready for it. And he found that he couldn't give the Corinthians solid food, was only able to feed them with milk. Today there are a lot of Christians who are feeding on milk. They're expecting the pastor or their church services to sustain them. And when they find out that we're imperfect anyway, and that churches have limitations, they search everywhere else, always looking for the source of living water. But what God wants is for people to come to him directly for sustenance and for guidance and for that source of living water. The apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and the teachers, they're here to equip the saints for ministry, not to do the work of the ministry. They're not here to be constantly spending their time feeding milk to the church. There is a time for growing newborns. I talked about seasons earlier on. And there's a time for people to grow and mature spiritually. But there's also a time for people to find their own solid food and their water straight from the source, straight from Jesus. And that's why a couple of months ago, Pastor Terry talked about 10 minutes that will change your life. And you can watch that 2-part series on our website, journeychurch.co.nz. And there's also some flyers up the back with how to have a quiet time, how to spend that time with God. And it's just a guide to get you started. You can grow it from there. But you see, what we don't need is more Christians sitting around getting fat on milk. We need people who are willing to stand up and be counted. People who have found the source of living water, who are overflowing with that love for God and that love for others. And we need people who are hungry, who are desperate to do the will of God, not out of obligation. I'm not trying to put anything on you. Not trying to put a new burden on you. I want you to find Jesus' burden, the one that he's designed and created you for. But when we're walking in the plans that God has for us, then comes a harvest, and we'll find joy that is like nothing else. So firstly, living water. Jesus is the source, the only source of living water. Secondly, food. Walking in God's plans for our lives is like food for our souls. And thirdly, the harvest. John 4, verse 16 to 19. Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come back." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." And Jesus said to her, "You're right in saying you've got no husband, for you've had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. what you've said is true." And the woman said, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." And so John 4, 28 to 31, the woman left her water jar and went into town and said to the people, "Come and see a man who told me all that I ever did. Could this be the Christ?" So they went out of the town and they were coming to him. And many Samaritans from that town believed in Jesus because of the woman's testimony when she said, "He told me all that I ever did." And you know, today there is a generation of lost people. They're searching desperately for purpose and meaning in life. And faced with a sea of opportunity like never before, I think this is the thing that sometimes we forget, that globalization has made so many opportunities and so much information, it's actually frightening some people. People are giving up on the ideals that we've expected people will be striving for in the Western world and the 20th century culture, and they're giving up on those in droves. There's minimalists, people who choose to live with no more than 50 possessions at any one time. If you try and think of 50 possessions, I mean, you're already probably got 10 on you, on your person at the moment, with your wallet, your phone, your clothes, all of your shoes, everything like that. Living with no more than 50 possessions at a time. There's vegans, those who choose not to eat meat, poultry, fish, even honey, because bees do work to create the honey. All because they have a hunger to see change in the world around them. There are even those who are giving up on alcohol, caffeine, sugar, because they don't want to be a slave to any substance. And there's the all too common story of the workaholic who finds their entire purpose in their career. Just like Reuben, though, there'll come a day when your work, your reputation alone will not be enough to keep you fulfilled. Now, you may or may not identify with these examples, but there's plenty more. And the key point is that there are millions of people living today in our own backyards and neighborhoods who are desperately hungry. They're desperately searching for meaning in their lives. And the church, I think, has become too afraid to talk about Jesus because we think that the world no longer wants to hear about him. And to some extent, that might be true. They don't want to hear about him. But today, just as much as any point in history, there are people who are hungry. They might not want to hear about him, but they need to hear about him. And in the third world, people are hungry because they don't have access to adequate food and water. But in the West, we're hungry because we don't have spiritual food. And in the church, we've dumbed down the cause to get people in the door. But it's just resulted in watered down Christianity. We've compromised to make it easier. We tell people, oh no, it's not that hard, being a Christian's easy. But in the end, people recognize that our weak and flimsy gospel is not worth dying for and it's not worth living for. It doesn't satiate anyone's hunger, with the result that more people are leaving out the back door than coming in the front door. But deep down, people know that there is something more to life than they've seen and experienced. And there are people who are searching. It's going to take a lot of love for some of them to come around to Jesus. And with Reuben, it took years and eventual crisis for him to see the light. But with others, like the woman at the well, it took a word of knowledge, spoken at the right time, and she was changed. And you know, all these causes out there that people are living for, we've got the greatest cause of all. And here's the point. If you're tired and you're weary, don't receive this as a heavy burden. Come to Jesus and drink from the well. He wants to give you rest. And he's got water that won't run out. He wants to teach you how to receive milk from him and in season receive solid food. But if you're searching for meaning and purpose, if you already know that love and you're filled to overflowing, welcome to the greatest cause of all. If you want to see people set free, free from the desire to accumulate and to gain selfishly at the expense of others. If you want to see a world in which love is the currency that matters, then come to God and seek Him. He will lead you in the plans that He's already prepared in advance for you to do. All you need to do is walk in them, and it will be like food for your soul. Just as we wrap up this morning, in verse 35, Jesus, talking to His disciples, said, "Do you not say, 'There are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest'? But look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are ripe. They're ready for harvest." So look around you. The fields are ready for harvest. The fruit is about to fall off the tree. There's food all around us in abundance. There's plenty of work to be done. Yet there aren't enough people who are willing to be used by God to bring in the harvest. So how are we to achieve this? We demonstrate that we are God's disciples by the love we have for Him, by the love we have for each other, and the love we have for the world around us. We call it the 3 communions: communion with God, communion with each other, and communion with the lost. And that's what we're talking about when He said, the world will know that you are my disciples. They will know that He exists by the love we have for each other. I'm really excited about the future of the journey. I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop talking about it. And at the moment, we're busy designing resources to help equip the saints, that's all of us, for ministry. And we're going to help you to sow seeds in season that will in turn reap a harvest. And I can't wait to see the church full of people who are full of God's love to overflowing, and people who have found spiritual food and are walking in God's plans for their lives and can't stop talking about it because they've seen the change that has happened in their lives through coming to know God. As Jesus said, we will find this work to be food for our souls. It will fulfill us. His work and His water will be like food and drink for our souls. Life is all about loving others. Now that we know the love of God, we need to give that love away. So what are the next steps from here? Firstly, if you don't know Jesus, or if you feel disconnected from Him, if you've had one of those years where you're just absolutely exhausted and you don't want to be thinking about the future, you don't want to be thinking about doing work, I want to pray for you. I want to encourage you to come to Him daily and to drink deep from the well of eternal life that He has for you. And secondly, I want to pray for our community. This is where the main work of the ministry takes place. This is where people see that God is real by the love we have for each other. Not by the pastors sharing a message, not by Sundays, but by that community and by that love. Firstly, in our own lives, love for God. Secondly, in our community, love for each other. And then thirdly, taking that to the world around us. So every head bowed and every eye closed. I want to pray. Lord, I pray for those who don't know You or who feel disconnected from You. Father, draw them in with Your love. Fill them with Your well of living water that they may not run dry. And Lord, I pray for our small groups and our community and all of those groups yet to start and for the journey, that You would prepare us for the exciting work that You've got for us to do. I pray also for the harvest that You're preparing. Those who already have the seeds of the gospel sown in their lives, that You'd bring them to us in Your timing, and that we would be ready to help them come to know Your love and the plans and purposes that You have for their lives. Amen.